Yesterday was the release date for Marvel Studios' The Fantastic Four First Steps, and this seems to be the most excited people have been for an MCU release in some time. Yes, Deadpool and Wolverine was very successful, but it looks like Fantastic Four First Steps may actually outdo it at the box office. And in today's video, we are going to be looking at some of the Easter eggs, references, and hints to the future of these characters in this movie. Now, I've saved all of the spoiler-heavy references for the end of the video, and I will warn you before I start touching on those. But with that said, let's roll the intro. So one of the best things about Fantastic Four First Steps is just how respectful it is to its creators. It makes me really sad that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby weren't alive to see this movie on the big screen, because compared to the earlier attempts at making a Fantastic Four movie, this is the one that is closest to the source material. And the movie pays respect to not only Stan Lee, but heavily respects Jack Kirby. The biggest reference comes in the fact that the Fantastic Four's Earth 828, was chosen because August 28th was Jack Kirby's birthday. And while there are plenty of Stan Lee references, cameos across every single Marvel project, Jack Kirby is somebody who typically gets neglected. And it's nice to see them paying tribute to this iconic creator. We even get a small cameo by two actors who resemble Jack Kirby and Stan Lee in the middle of the movie. And they are most likely working for the earlier iteration of Marvel known as Timely Comics. Timely is confirmed to exist on Earth 828 at the end of the movie. You could see it in Times Square during the climax of the movie. And there are a couple other references to Stan Lee specifically. First of all, we have the Fantastic Four's rocket named the Excelsior, which was Stan Lee's catchphrase. But we also saw a smaller hint in the background during one of the Thing's earlier scenes with a storefront sharing Stan Lee's name. I really want to highlight the young Stan Lee and Jack Kirby cameo that we get in the movie, because it was probably the most tasteful way they could have done this cameo. We didn't get a CGI face replacement of the actors. We got two guys who looked enough like Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, working on comic books and looking out their window, which is also a reference to what Marvel traditionally stands for. It's the universe that's happening right outside your window. That pretty much does it for the references specifically talking about the comic creators, or at least all the ones that I spotted when watching the movie. Next, we are going to talk about some of the references and Easter eggs connecting this universe to the MCU's sacred timeline. Now, I am going back for a second viewing because I really want to get a good idea of what's going on in the background of a lot of these storefronts. Some of them have very referential names, and one of the ones I noticed in Times Square is Westview Appliances. Now, I feel like I don't need to explain this heavily, but Westview was the town that Wanda Maximoff put her hex over in WandaVision, where Fantastic Four First Steps director Matt Shakman served as the director of the entire series. I assumed we would get some kind of WandaVision clue in there somewhere, and I thought this was a really clever way to do so. Next, we have the Pan Am building making an appearance, and this one may need a little bit of explanation if you're unfamiliar with Pan Am. Now, Pan Am was the biggest international airline of its time. They had some financial trouble in the 1970s and are now out of business, but they were at the top of their game in the 1950s and 60s, which makes sense given the setting of Fantastic Four First Steps. Now, what does this have to do with the sacred timeline? Well, the Pan Am building actually did exist in New York City, but it is now known as the MetLife building, which, if you're familiar with the MCU, you know is the in-universe location of Avengers Tower. It has some play in the earlier bits of the movie, but I think it is a very nice subtle reference to Earth 616 of the MCU. We also see Reed Richards boring children on his kid-centered science show, where he's talking about parallel Earths and primarily the multiverse. Very fitting given the fact that this is the multiverse saga and we will be seeing them interact with Earth 616 in Avengers Doomsday. And the last bit that I noticed is WHIH making an appearance. And this is a fictional news outlet specific to the MCU that has been appearing since The Incredible Hulk. Marvel has also used the name of this outlet in order to promote movies like Ant-Man and Captain America Civil War by offering in-universe interviews with certain characters from the movies. That's gonna wrap it up for the Sacred Timeline references. There weren't too many, which was a big relief to me, but I did enjoy the ones that we had. The next thing we're gonna look at is some of the Fantastic Four comic and earlier media references that this movie made. Now, I will acknowledge that some of these may be considered spoilers. I'm not gonna be talking about any major plot elements, but things mentioned, and maybe some things that weren't explicitly said in any of the marketing material for Fantastic Four First Steps. And now that you have your spoiler warning, I'm going to continue. We get references to all kinds of Fantastic Four villains from the comics. These ones only get mentions in live action and they never actually appear, but we hear about the Wizard, Puppet Master, and Diablo. Now, the Wizard is a very frequent Fantastic Four villain who first appeared in Strange Tales number 102 in November 1962. His first appearance featured him going up against just the Human Torch, and later organizing the Frightful Four in order to take down the Fantastic Four. Puppet Master is also another early Fantastic Four villain appearing in Fantastic Four number 8, and he's probably known best as the father of Ben Grimm's love interest, Alicia Masters, who I am curious if we'll see in the future because, as I mentioned, we don't see Puppet Master at all, and we don't even get a mention of Alicia Masters. Then of course we have Diablo, who first appeared in Fantastic Four number 30. Now, this version of Diablo would have been really interesting to see because his origin is heavily tied to Mephisto, somebody we just met in Ironheart. Now, it seems like these villains weren't ever going to tie into any part of the plot of Fantastic Four First Steps in any way. But, and we have already talked about this, we get mention of Red Ghost and his super apes. Red Ghost was actually set to appear in the movie, portrayed by John Malkovich. However, his scenes got cut for whatever reason, and we only get a brief battle between Reed Richards and one of the super apes. I've mentioned it before that I would really like to see an extended version of this movie. There were a few things from the trailer that weren't in the final movie, and I am kind of curious to see what John Malkovich's take on Red Ghost could have been. I do wonder why it was cut though, because Malkovich, as I mentioned, is a big get for the MCU. Maybe the character just wasn't working out on screen. I don't know, but I am curious to see what he would have been like in this movie. And the other major Fantastic Four villain that we do see a bit of in this movie is Mole Man, played by Paul Walter Hauser. I was a little disappointed with his general appearance in the movie. I thought they could have gone a little far with his wardrobe. Instead, he just has the iconic goggles. However, everything else about the character is pretty spot on. The performance is great. He comes from Subterranea, which does play a role in the movie. However, I was disappointed to see the Moloids were simply just people. I thought they could have went a little bit farther with this character to make him a bit sillier, because we did see that Giganto did exist in some form in this movie. And no, it wasn't the version we saw in that Little Caesars commercial. I did really like the inclusion though, because I did like the role he had to play in the movie. We also saw a majority of these villains appear in the second post-credit scene, in an homage to the 1960s Marvel animated series. It was delightfully cheesy. I really enjoyed that bit. I noticed some people were a little confused and just kind of turned off by that being the second post-credit scene. But with Marvel movies, you just kind of have to expect that you're going to get a serious mid-credit scene and probably a jokey or no post-credit scene. Now, the final big comic reference that we get in the movie is the beginning of the Future Foundation. The Future Foundation doesn't get a ton of play in the movie. However, we do get small details here and there, such as later in the movie when we get a shot of the moon, we see a Future Foundation flag there instead of the typical American flag. This also doesn't tie to anything, but it was kind of one of those cool multiverse Easter eggs. Instead of NASA existing in this universe, it's ANSA. It reminded me of the Spider-Verse movies where brands and things that exist in real life are tweaked so that they could be specific to that universe. Now, the final thing I want to talk about are some of the references to earlier Fantastic Four movies. In the movie, the Human Torch has a small talking action figure of himself that the Thing destroys in turn. This is very similar to something that happened in the 2005 movie where Johnny Storm is teasing Ben Grimm with a Thing action figure, leading to him destroying the toy. And we also get cameos from the cast members of the 1994 Fantastic Four movie that never was. Following the Ted Gilbert montage explaining the origin of the Fantastic Four, a variety of different people were all thanking the Fantastic Four, and some of them were the cast members of that original movie. I'm really glad that the cast members of that movie got some acknowledgement here, because if you're unfamiliar with the production of 1994's Fantastic Four, they were given a very raw deal. There's a great documentary called Doomed: The Untold Story of Roger Corman's The Fantastic Four that I highly recommend. Alright, this last part of the video, I am going full spoilers. These are the Doomsday connections I could make given what we've seen in this movie. I'm gonna give you a minute to leave if you don't want to be spoiled yet, but without further ado, let's talk a little bit about Doctor Doom. Now, early in the movie, we see a meeting of nations, with the only empty seat being that of Latveria, which is the fictional country that Doctor Doom rules. And that helps to set up the mid-credit scene of the movie, where we see our first glimpse of Doctor Doom's cloak and mask, as he begins to interact with a 4-year-old Franklin Richards. Now, let's talk a little bit about Franklin Richards himself. In the movie, the Fantastic Four go to attempt to negotiate with Galactus in order to save Earth, and Galactus tells them he wants Franklin Richards because he is the one destined to be next in line to sit on his throne and end Galactus' suffering. Reed Richards specifically doesn't believe that, as he spent the early parts of the movie running every single test he can to determine whether or not Franklin Richards will be enhanced. However, Galactus alludes to the fact that Franklin is simply hiding his power from him, and that's where the Earth X parallels begin. In Earth X, Franklin Richards is the one who sits on Galactus' throne. It is also the comic run that establishes Shalla-Bal as the Silver Surfer. Now, Franklin's powers itself are pretty vague, and they can essentially be whatever they need to be at that specific moment. He can warp reality, create universes, but he's an interesting character because he doesn't really want that power. Now, as a child, he doesn't really fully comprehend the power that he has. So when we get to the post-credit scene and we see Doom sitting beside Franklin Richards, I think it's pretty obvious what the MacGuffin for Doomsday and Secret Wars is going to be, and kind of gives an idea of how the MCU is going to be rebooted. My idea is that the prime universe of the MCU has essentially been scattered, which is why we have the Fantastic Four in one universe, the X-Men in another, and the rest of the Avengers and Spider-Man on the central Earth. So I think we are going to be seeing a total remaking of the multiverse following Avengers Doomsday. This is how we get Battleworld and Secret Wars, and my main assumption is that Franklin Richards is going to be playing a role similar to Molecule Man in Secret Wars. He will be the one recreating the universe, and the Fantastic Four are either going to have to try and wipe his mind so he doesn't remember he has these abilities, or we'll see Franklin Richards leave for a while in order to try and recreate the multiverse, similar to how the Fantastic Four did in the Secret Wars comic run. And I wonder if this is a way that they could introduce Valeria Richards, who is probably one of the most interesting Fantastic Four characters. Now, before I make a second video, I am going to go see the movie a second time, so I can figure out more theories or possibilities for what we could be seeing in Doomsday. But I think that's going to do it for today's video. Leave a comment down below if you found an Easter egg that I happened to miss. Like this video, subscribe for more content, and I will see you in the next video.